Hello, welcome to Medyascope. Turkey went to the ballot box on Sunday to vote on the historical constitutional referendum. According to the unofficial results, 51.4% of the electorate voted for yes, and 48.6% of the electorate voted for no. However, two parties of the no campaign, the CHP and the HDP, will contest the result. Also, OSCE, Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, published a report yesterday and say that the referendum was contested on an unlevel playing field. Today, our guest is Emma Sinclair Webb, senior Turkey researcher of Human Rights Watch since 2007. Before that, Ms. Webb was a researcher on Turkey for Amnesty International from 2003 until 2007. Ms. Webb has been living in Turkey for many years and knows the politics of the country very well. And today we will discuss the referendum campaigns the referendum campaigns of the both camps, OSCE's report, and also the contestations over the results. So I want to start with the atmosphere before the referendum. According to your observations, under what kind of circumstances Turkey went to the ballot box and how the two camps conducted their campaigns? But while asking this, I also wonder, what do you think were the main and important events and issues that led to the shaping of these circumstances?
Well, thank you very much for having me on your program. I think, the whole campaign took place in a context of unprecedented political repression. That's not something we say lightly, but all the evidence shows that when you look at the whole context of the build-up to the campaigns themselves, we have to go back a few months because, of course, this all takes place in the aftermath of the failed 15th of July military coup and the state of emergency. And under state of emergency, we've seen an incredible crackdown in Turkey, which has really taken it in a very different direction from, I think, what we would have imagined just a year ago. One of the most obvious symptoms has been the enormous assault on the media, which started, of course, well before. That's one theme I want to focus on. The other theme I want to look at is the crackdown on the judiciary and the enormous pressure on courts in Turkey, with the removal of so many judges alleged to have Gülenist affiliations. And also, the direct interference from the government in court decisions that we've seen building and getting ever more, actually. The other aspect, the third aspect I would focus on is the huge crackdown on the pro-Kurdish opposition, parliamentary opposition, HDP. The People's Democratic Party, HDP, and also, I think, slightly neglected the whole assault on local government in the southeast of the country with the removal of so many elected mayors throughout southeast municipalities. In fact, an assault on the sister party of the HDP, the Democratic Regions Party. I think that's often left out of the picture in this story. Coming to your question of sort of what are the important events that we saw, I think, the closure of media outlets, the jailing of so many journalists, and it takes us up to around 150 journalists and media workers together. And I'm counting media workers because we have some people jailed who are not writing for media, but were actually working for media as executives or even in administrative roles. But they're in jail because they were associated with, for example, Zaman newspaper. And Cumhuriyet newspaper board members, indeed, who were not writers, and lawyers among them. That huge number in jail, no indictments for a long time of those people, though we are seeing now indictments appearing. And then you know, I think that really sets up a climate before you go into the campaign period in which you have no real public discussion in media. You have some outlets like Cumhuriyet newspaper, like websites, Diken, Grihat, then you have Artı Gerçek, these kinds of websites, and where, you know, things are discussed. But these, of course, don't have the enormous reach of print media and television, of conventional mainstream television. And so you really basically cleared out the media before you go into a period where you're going to decide, make a momentous decision about the future of the country's political institutions and way of governance. And this is the biggest decision that's been made since probably 1946, 1950, let's say, you know, the onset of multi-party elections. And, you know, this fundamentally changes the political environment for Turkey going forward into the future. But in advance of taking that decision, you've actually got rid of critical media in Turkey, or independent media, and media that have the possibility of having a kind of, initiating a debate, a back and forth, questioning government, getting government to answer them. This is the function of the media is not just news, of course, but scrutiny of the government, and to get political leaders, politicians, to have to answer and to have to feel accountable to the public. And if you get rid of a media that won't hold the government to account and won't hold political leaders to account, you've effectively diminished political debate in a whole country, so that the public sphere is a sort of empty one, or a one where, you know, it's you just hear the echoes of the messages from those in power, and you have no other messages really able to debate with power. So it's not just being critical of government, it's actually being able to raise the debate, to have a higher level debate about politics and about what politics should mean, about what the accountability of political leaders is. So that's one thing. So that's the media angle.
You also mentioned judiciary and HDP. We can, like...
Yeah, the judiciary, I mean, the judiciary we've seen, I mean, this is very connected, of course. It's a longer process. We've seen huge rotations of judges and prosecutors over the last 2 years, ever since the corruption inquiries began, ever since the sort of big power struggle emerged between the AKP and the Gülen movement. But, you know, basically the rotations of judges after the 15th of July coup attempt turned into the imprisonment of judges. And it's a very, very serious matter in any country if you actually jail judges. Once you jail judges, you are really undermining the possibility of courts to, you know, have any kind of independence at all. So, you know, while of course you can investigate judges, you can investigate them for disciplinary, you know, dereliction of duty, such things. But actually, just to throw judges in jail and prosecutors in jail is another matter. And we've seen vast numbers of judges and prosecutors jailed and removed. I think it's 400 dismissed and about 2,500 jailed, and beyond that, and then replaced with new judges and prosecutors. But what we've seen alongside that is not just, it doesn't only impact on the whole sort of, you know, real purge of Gülenists that we're seeing, or alleged Gülenists. It also impacts on things like how courts will dare deal with cases of journalists who are in prison. So the most recent decision we saw, highly controversial and problematic, was that 21 journalists, I think in early April, were bailed, released by a court. But, you know, immediately after pro-government journalists and commentators tweeted about it, those journalists were not released from prison. they were rearrested, and they haven't come out of jail. They've been, 8 of them were again were kept in jail, and another 13 or 12, I think, actually, are rearrested on other charges, coup plotting charges. So not only did they do that to those journalists under government pressure, but they also then removed 3 judges, suspended 3 judges, and suspended a prosecutor who had participated in the decision, who had made the decision to bail the journalists. So here we get the judiciary issue, pressure on the judiciary, totally intersecting with pressure on media. And this is a very poisonous combination. And I think another aspect is we've seen extremely weak indictments of journalists produced all through this period, with really reliant upon very little evidence of anything that could or should be described as criminal wrongdoing, let alone terrorism. So that's the climate.
Yeah, also you said as an overlooked issue, the crackdown on HDP and on the municipalities. I think it's also important for the campaigns, especially for the no campaign before the referendum on Sunday. Can you talk a bit more on that? Like, how did the crackdown on HDP affected the political campaigns conducted before Sunday?
Well, of course, this goes back to a very long plan, this we're talking here, because it goes back to May 2016, wherein there was a very problematic decision to lift the immunity of most of the HDP members of parliament and other members of parliament too. But then the treatment of the two was extremely, of the different members of parliament was very unfair and unequal. So the HDP parliamentarians were arrested in November. And the 4th of November is a very important date. That's the date when Selahattin Demirtas and others were jailed, and they have been in jail ever since. So they were totally unable to participate in the discussion of the constitutional amendment that happened then in December, and they have been kept out of the whole process. So this was, I think, a clear plan to remove the pro-Kurdish parliamentary opposition, the second opposition party in parliament, from the political scene before the referendum discussions began, so that they wouldn't be part of it and that they wouldn't be then part of the campaign. Now, we're talking here about the removal of the most articulate voices in that party. And even when, one of them, Idris Baluken, was bailed, in fact, at the very end of January, he was rapidly rearrested just weeks later after having an operation in hospital. Because I think, there was a real decision from above that they did not want these voices to be campaigning. So we've had 13 HDP members of parliament out of the picture. The other thing I think neglected in this is that the municipalities in the southeast have been taken over. Now, generally it's described as appointing trustees to run municipalities. In fact, that's a misnomer. I would describe it as a takeover by central government of elected municipalities. So instead of just removing mayors who were under criminal investigation, it was a removal of mayors and then no reappointment of somebody from the Democratic Regions Party to run the municipality, like a member of the local assembly, of the local council, but rather appointing in the so-called trustee position either the governor of the province or the district governor to do the job of the mayors. And that, the problem with that, and I don't see how this will really end, is, this removes, it deprives voters of their elected representatives in local government. It basically says you have no right to have, your chosen representatives running municipalities. The government knows best. The government will run the municipalities. So it's a sort of suspension of local democracy in the southeast.
So So you agree with OSCE's observation that the referendum was contested on an unlevel playing field, right? That's from what you're...
Absolutely. I mean, that's the facts tell it how it is. I mean, it doesn't take the OSCE to say it, in fact. I mean, the facts really speak for themselves. If you take all these actions together, you know, you are creating a very unlevel playing field. There is no equality of opportunity in the campaign around the referendum. So, you know, and then the OSCE report, which we'll discuss, of course, looks closely at questions like how much airtime.
Yeah, that's what I wanted to get in, like OSCE published its reports and you read it. So what do you think are OSCE's most important findings and observations? What did you find most important in that 15-page report?
Yes,
I guess, preliminary report.
Preliminary report. Yeah. Well, it's actually a very technical report, and I think just to step back and say something about the OSCE. OSCE does election monitoring in all the states that are members of the OSCE, and that's 57 different states, in fact. And it's an organization that's all about ensuring security and strengthening democracy, and it has many different institutions attached to it. So the election observation unit is part of, you know, it's just one part of the OSCE, and it's called it's part of an institution called the Office for Democratic Institutions and Human Rights. So that's the unit that undertakes the monitoring. Now, election observers from the OSCE, from this unit, come at the invitation of the government. So the Turkish government invited the OSCE to come and perform election monitoring in Turkey, and that's a standard process. What the OSCE can do is to write a factual report, report its observations, and reflect with, you know, looking at Council of Europe standards, OSCE election standards, can reflect on the legal framework in which the process occurs, as well as, you know, on the day of the referendum itself, going around some ballot boxes and commenting on what it sees in ballot boxes. But its role is, you know, this was a limited observation, actually. It wasn't conducted by a mass team. I think there were about 26 members of the team. So you can imagine that results in, on referendum day, an assessment of actually rather few ballot boxes. They don't have the capacity to go and look at exactly what happens all over the country. That's out of their mandate and out of their they don't have the human capacity to do that. So what they comment on is the landscape before, the campaign itself, the legal framework, things like the registration of voters and how that takes place. And some of these issues are very technical issues. And I must say the report, you know, is written in a very plain language. It's written in a very detailed way. It's quite dry in that sense. They don't make political observations. They don't have lots of sound bites in their reports. I mean, they do have a press release, but it's not full of polemic or at all. I mean, quite the reverse, I think. You know, they're not aiming to sort of, you know, make an enormous kind of I mean, they don't make a great big political judgment at the end. They make a rather technical judgment.
But
so
their conclusion is that the legal framework in Turkey was inadequate for holding off a genuinely democratic process, and I quoted this from the report. So yeah. What led them to come to this conclusion?
Well, they look at lots of facts, like, I mean, they particularly focus on the way in which for example, the Supreme Board of Elections makes decisions, how transparent its decisions are, the rules and regulations for appealing. They look at things like that, and that's where they find a lot of problems, I think. They also look at the relationship between the Supreme Board of Elections and the district boards and the provincial boards. So it's quite technical at the legal framework level. One of the things they comment on, which I think is very striking, is that under the state of emergency, by decree, one of a very important aspect was there was a very important cancellation of the imperative for broadcasters to have impartial coverage of the campaign and to equally represent the different sides in the campaign, the different political sides. So by decree, the impartiality rule was cancelled by decree, and that they found very problematic, because what then happened was that the ruling party and President Erdogan himself then were able to have a much greater share of time on the airwaves. So when they looked at the television coverage, then they assessed this from their own monitoring. They said 76% of airtime on TV was taken up with the Yes campaign, and 77.5% of press coverage in the newspapers they looked at was taken up with the Yes campaign and was predominantly positive about the Yes campaign. Whereas when it came to the No campaign, 23.5% coverage of the No campaign in the media they looked at and on television, and that was mostly neutral in tone. Well, of course, it should be neutral. That would be better if it was all neutral. But, you know, it does mean that the No campaign, as we saw very much, I think, and as people in Turkey know, was very much underrepresented in the media and in the public sphere more generally. And in terms of banners, in terms of, you know, just manifestations of the Yes campaign, they were everywhere, and the No campaign wasn't, for sure. And you could say, I mean, the government would probably argue that that's because the AKP is a stronger party and it has more support, and that's reflected naturally. But you know, this is a referendum, it's not a general election.
Exactly.
And equality of access to airtime and media is very important. So actually, a state of emergency decree actually made for a very inequitable situation in the media.
And you've been living in Turkey for 10 years and you've seen other elections. How do you compare this referendum and the campaigns before it and the referendum itself to previous elections you've witnessed?
Well, I mean, I think, you know, when people lose an election, they always, you know, people are going to look for irregularities. They are going to look for problems with any poll. That's normal. There are often appeals, but I've never seen as many appeals as we're seeing at the moment. And I think there's you know, we'll come on to the question, of course, the very controversial question, which is the Supreme Board of Elections changing the rules. Yeah. Now, this is, I think, probably the one finding of the OSCE report that's got the most coverage in Turkey, in opposition media circles, is the fact that the OSCE said that it was, you know, violated the law and undermined the process, that the Supreme Board of Elections actually decided at the 11th hour, well, I mean, late in the day, to permit ballots without stamps from the polling stations. So now that clearly, you know, one of the things I think about this is that I've never seen so much, you know, debate about the process as I've seen this time. And I think one of the things, you know, we're not a body as Human Rights Watch that monitors elections or that can make any judgment about whether things are unfair as far as the detail of the process, like stamps and things. Those are the kind of issues we haven't got the capacity or the mandate to look at. But I do think, you know, public confidence in the process should be a matter of huge concern for the government as much as for the opposition. Because at the end of the day, you know, no government really wants people to be questioning whether the process was fair, because that undermines things very deeply. So what we're seeing now is a very deep challenge to the process, to what happened, and whether it was fair. A deep challenge about changing the regulations at the last moment. and whether that can be appealed and what an appeal might be. So, you know, I haven't seen an election like this, I would say, since I've worked on Turkey.
And what's the importance of OEC's report? Why OEC writing this report should be, like, why it's important?
Well, I think it's important because, you know, it actually provides, and this is the intention of the exercise, is to provide a useful framework for looking at how to strengthen democracy and how to strengthen the process of elections. I mean, I'm talking about this aspect of the OSCE's work, not its other mandate, which is about security and all sorts of other things. And I think, you know, a confident government and a confident country benefits very much from the kinds of technical advice and assistance that bodies like the OSCE and indeed the Council of Europe can provide in how to draft legislation, in how to strengthen democratic process and procedure. So I think the reaction to, you know, criticisms by the OSCE and commentary by the OSCE is a marker of how confident political leaders feel. And you know, they perform, I think the OSCE and especially the Council of Europe also perform a very valuable function. We've seen lots of reports by the Venice Commission on Turkey in the last few months.
Just to go back to what you said, I found it quite interesting. So you think that somehow like Turkish government lost its self-confidence? Is this something that you observe?
Well, I wouldn't want to make a sweeping generalization about it, but I do think, you know, it's imperative to take on constructive criticism and take it very seriously and be able to respond to it in good faith with, and show that you find it valuable if you want to strengthen the quality of democracy in your country. And rather than dismiss the findings of the OSCE, as we've seen both the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and the President do, it would be much better, of course, to take up the findings and have, you know, a serious conversation about strengthening democratic process.
Okay. So I have a new question about the aftermath of the referendum. So we've seen that the cabinet has decided to extend the state of emergency, and also in his speech after the results were announced, President Erdogan talked about reintroducing the death penalty. So as a human rights researcher who has been working in Turkey for 10 years, what do you think about these two new developments?
Well, it's very disappointing to hear that the state of emergency is going to be extended. You know, basically, even after winning the referendum, winning the vote, there is still a perceived need by the government and the president to have exceptional powers to rule by decree, to continue to conduct arrests, dismissals, and arbitrary bans on broadcasts, media, and the like, without judicial review, without effective judicial review. And that's a very disappointing move, and one which will make the human rights framework of Turkey increasingly depleted and eroded as we go ahead. So I think it undermines the rule of law profoundly. We criticize states of emergency not only in Turkey, we criticize the state of emergency in France as well, though there is no comparison between the implementation of state of emergency in France, where the judiciary is robust, and the state of emergency in Turkey, which you know, has undermined the judiciary very fundamentally. And I think, you know, the other aspect of the death penalty, we've seen this discussed repeatedly over the last few months, and it would be an enormous and disastrous backward step for Turkey to bring back the death penalty, bring back capital punishment. You know, capital punishment is an inherently cruel, irreversible form of punishment, which human rights groups reject. the Council of Europe also rejects it. So if Turkey were to take up the death penalty once again and reinstate it, it would put Turkey at complete odds with the Council of Europe and with all its other international obligations that it's signed up to, treaties and conventions. So it would be a very disappointing step. And I remember very well when the death penalty was abolished. It was abolished in stages by the government, first of all by the government before the AKP, the coalition government before, and then by the AKP in 2004. In all circumstances, in 2004, it was abolished. Now, this was one of the major fundamental reforms to satisfy the bid for EU membership. Mm-hmm. But, forgetting EU membership, this is a very positive reform that was made for the benefit of all citizens in Turkey and showing that Turkey was on the road to being a robust, rights-respecting democracy. So to go back and bring back the death penalty would be an incredibly backward step.
And President Erdogan, he also mentioned taking this to a referendum. What's your take on this claim?
Well, in general, I think the thinking among international bodies and international human rights groups is that to take issues of fundamental rights and freedoms to referendum is in general a bad idea. And I think, we would say that about this as well. Taking it to referendum in any country would be the wrong way to go. Now, you can, if you whip up enough popular sentiment in a very polarized political context like Turkey, you can always make the argument for the death penalty and find that people are receptive to the idea of it. And I don't just speak of Turkey. I think it's true in my country, in Britain, and in many other countries, that you could create a popular kind of demand for rapists to be hanged. Mm-hmm. That we hear that in lots of places. But to actually go through with that and to pursue that policy would be, really put Turkey on a completely different. It would ally Turkey with not with Europe, not with the Council of Europe, and not with its Western allies either.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you very much, Ms. Webb. Thank you for coming here today.
Thank you.
Today our guest was Emma Sinclair Webb. We discussed the political campaigns before the referendum, OCE's report on the constitutional referendum, and also the contestations around the results. Thank you very much for having watched us. Have a good day.